Millionaire refused his adopted black triplets into the mansion, until the black maid stepped in. "Sir, if you don't open that door right now and welcome those babies, I'll make sure everyone in Beverly Hills knows exactly what kind of man you really are." Grace's voice cut through the mansion's silence like a blade, her words directed at the millionaire who just refused his own adopted children entry to their new home. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Hawthorne Mansion in Beverly Hills, California, but Richard Hawthorne barely noticed. At 58, he moved through his palatial home like a ghost haunting his own life, each footstep echoing in rooms that had grown too large, too empty, too suffocating in their silence. He stood in his mahogany-paneled study, staring at the adoption papers scattered across his antique desk. 3 names stared back at him: Marcus, age 7; Maya, age 7; Michael, age 7. The ink was still fresh on the documents that had arrived from the Atlanta Department of Family Services just yesterday. Documents that his late wife Elena had set in motion before the cancer took her 6 months ago. "She always was too soft-hearted," he muttered, running his fingers through his silver hair. The words tasted bitter, even to him. Outside, he could hear the gentle humming that always announced Grace's presence. Grace Patterson had worked for the Hawthorne family for 15 years, ever since Elena had insisted they needed someone with a warm heart, not just good references. At 62, Grace moved through the house with quiet efficiency, but lately Richard had noticed something different in her demeanor, a barely contained energy, like she was holding back words that desperately wanted to be spoken. Grace was in the kitchen now, preparing far more breakfast than one lonely man would ever need. She'd been doing that for weeks, cooking for 4 instead of 1, setting the large dining table with the good china, arranging fresh flowers from the garden. Hope made manifest in her daily routines. "Mr. Richard," her warm voice called from the hallway, carrying the slight Georgia accent that never left her despite decades in California. "The car service just called. They'll be here in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Richard felt his chest tighten. 20 minutes until 3 children he'd never met would arrive at his door, expecting him to be their father. The father Elena had promised them in her final weeks, when the medication made her speak of dreams and redemption and second chances. He walked to the window overlooking the circular driveway, past the fountain Elena had loved and the rose garden she'd tended until her hands became too weak to hold the pruning shears. This house had been their sanctuary, their private world where old California money met new dreams. Now it felt more like a mausoleum. Down in the kitchen, Grace was humming again, an old spirit her grandmother used to sing back in Savannah. Amazing Grace had been Elena's favorite, and Grace had hummed it softly during those final nights when sleep wouldn't come and memories were all that remained. But today, her humming carried something else: determination. Grace had spent the entire week transforming 3 bedrooms on the 2nd floor. She'd driven to toy stores in Santa Monica and bookshops in Pasadena, choosing carefully, lovingly. Baseball gloves and art supplies, chapter books and nightlights shaped like stars. She'd hung cheerful curtains and placed stuffed animals on small beds, creating spaces that whispered welcome home in every detail. She'd also spent long evenings on the phone with Mrs. Rodriguez from the Atlanta office, learning everything she could about Marcus, Maya, and Michael. How Marcus loved astronomy and wanted to be the first person to walk on Mars. How Maya painted pictures of families that included dogs and grandmothers and everyone sitting around big dinner tables. How Michael, the quietest of the 3, collected bottle caps, and could remember every act of kindness anyone had ever shown him. Grace understood something that Richard, in his grief and fear, couldn't see yet. These children weren't coming to disrupt his carefully ordered life. They were coming to save it. What do you think happens when someone builds walls around their heart to protect it from more pain? Have you ever seen love break through barriers that seemed impossible to cross? Let me know in the comments below. The sound of car doors slamming shut echoed across the courtyard. Grace quickly smoothed her apron and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. She'd worn her best dress today, the navy blue one with small flowers that Elena had complimented so many times. If this was going to be a battle for the soul of this family, she was going to face it with dignity. Through the kitchen window, she could see them. 3 small figures climbing out of a white sedan, each clutching a single suitcase and looking up at the imposing mansion with a mixture of wonder and terror. Marcus stood protectively in front of his siblings, his shoulders squared in a way that broke Grace's heart. Maya held a rolled-up paper, probably one of her drawings, while Michael's free hand gripped a small teddy bear that had clearly seen better days. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. Elena had asked her to watch over them. Elena had whispered in those final days, "Grace, promise me you'll help Richard see. Help him remember how to love." She'd made that promise. Now it was time to keep it. But as Grace moved toward the front door, ready to welcome these children with the warmth they deserved, she heard footsteps on the stairs, Richard's footsteps, moving not toward the entrance but away from it, moving toward his study, where he could lock the door and pretend this day wasn't happening. The doorbell rang. 3 children waited on his doorstep, carrying nothing but hope and the trust that somewhere in this big house was a father who wanted them. And in that moment, Grace Patterson realized that this wouldn't just be about opening a door. It would be about opening a heart that had been closed for far too long. The doorbell's chime echoed through the mansion like a church bell calling for prayer, but Richard Hawthorne had already disappeared into his study, the heavy oak door clicking shut with finality. Grace stood frozen in the hallway for a heartbeat, listening to the silence that followed, a silence that spoke louder than any words could. Outside, 3 small voices murmured in hushed tones, their excitement barely contained despite their nervousness. "Is this really it?" Maya whispered, her voice carrying the breathless wonder of a child seeing magic for the first time. "Look at all those windows," Michael added softly. "Do you think we each get our own room?" Marcus, ever the protector, kept his voice steady. "Remember what Mrs. Rodriguez said. We stick together no matter what." Grace smoothed her dress one final time and opened the massive front door. The sight that greeted her nearly brought her to her knees. 3 pairs of eyes, brown and bright and full of hope, looked up at her. They were smaller than she'd expected, more fragile, each one clutching their possessions like lifelines. Maya's drawing was indeed a family portrait. Crayon figures holding hands in front of a house that looked remarkably like the one they now stood before. Michael's teddy bear was missing an eye but had been clearly loved into threadbare softness. And Marcus, despite his brave stance, had a small tremor in his hands that only someone who'd worked with children for decades would notice. "Hello, sweethearts," Grace said, her voice warm as Georgia honey. "I'm Grace. I've been waiting for you." Maya stepped forward first, always the boldest. "Are you our new grandma?" The question hit Grace like a gentle blow to the chest. I work here, baby girl. I take care of the house. Can you take care of us too?" Michael asked, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the Beverly Hills breeze. Before Grace could answer, Marcus cleared his throat with adult-like formality. We're looking for Mr. Richard Hawthorne. We're supposed to live here now." Grace's heart clenched. The hope in their faces was so pure, so complete, that she felt the weight of what was about to happen settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Come in," she said quickly, stepping aside. "You must be tired from your trip from Atlanta." They entered the foyer, and Grace watched their faces transform with wonder. The chandelier cast rainbows across the marble floor, and Maya immediately pointed upward, spinning in a slow circle. "It's like a palace," she breathed. "Wait until you see your rooms," Grace said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I've been getting them ready for weeks." Marcus set down his suitcase and looked around with the calculating gaze of a child who'd learned too young not to trust good things. "Where is he?" "Mr. Hawthorne." Grace's mouth went dry. She glanced toward the study, where she could see the shadow of feet beneath the door. He was standing right there just 20 feet away, listening to every word. He's in an important meeting," she lied, the words tasting like ash. "But he'll—" The study door opened. Richard emerged, and Grace's breath caught at the sight of him. His face was a mask of cold composure, but she'd known him long enough to see the storm brewing beneath. His hands were clenched at his sides, his jaw set in the way that meant he'd made a decision and wouldn't be swayed from it. The children turned toward him with identical expressions of nervous excitement. Maya clutched her drawing tighter. Michael hugged his teddy bear. Marcus straightened his shoulders and took a small step forward. "Mr. Hawthorne?" Marcus's voice cracked slightly. "We're Marcus, Maya, and Michael. We're supposed to be your kids now." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace watched Richard's face, saw the moment when something shut down behind his eyes, the same something that had been shutting down for months, ever since Elena's funeral. "No," he said simply. The word fell into the foyer like a stone into still water, sending ripples of confusion across 3 young faces. "I'm sorry." Marcus blinked, certain he'd misheard. Richard's voice was steady, businesslike, as if he were declining a dinner invitation rather than rejecting 3 children who'd traveled across the country to find their father. "This was a mistake. Elena made this arrangement without consulting me. I will not be taking custody of you." Maya's drawing fluttered to the floor as her small hand went slack. Michael took a step backward, bumping into Grace's legs. Marcus just stood there, processing words that couldn't possibly mean what they seemed to mean. "But—" Maya's voice was tiny now, all the wonder drained out of it. "But the lady in Atlanta said, she said you wanted us. She said you signed papers. The papers were signed under emotional circumstances. I was not thinking clearly." Richard's voice never wavered, but Grace caught the slight tremor in his hands. "I've contacted the department. They'll arrange for your transport back to Atlanta tomorrow." Grace felt something shatter inside her chest. "Richard." "Mrs. Patterson will see that you're fed and have somewhere to sleep tonight." He continued as if she hadn't spoken, as if 3 small hearts weren't breaking right in front of him. "But this house, this is not your home." Michael started to cry first, silent tears that rolled down his cheeks as he pressed his face against his teddy bear. Maya picked up her drawing with trembling hands, staring at the crayon family that would never exist. And Marcus. Marcus just nodded once, his face setting into an expression far too adult for a 7-year-old boy. "Okay," Marcus said quietly. "We understand." But they didn't understand. How could they? They were children who'd been promised a father, a home, a family, and were instead being told they were unwanted before they'd even set foot fully inside. Richard turned to go back to his study, but Grace's voice stopped him cold. "Elena would be ashamed of you." He froze, his hand on the doorknob, but he didn't turn around. "These babies didn't ask to be here, Richard Hawthorne. They didn't ask to lose their first family, or their second, or to spend years hoping someone might love them enough to keep them. But your wife saw something in them worth fighting for. Worth dying for." Richard's shoulders tensed, but still he didn't turn. "And you?" Grace's voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. "You're going to send them away because you're too scared to love something you might lose again." Finally, Richard looked back. His eyes met Grace's for just a moment, and she saw the pain there, raw and bleeding and desperate. But then the mask slipped back into place. "Find them rooms in the guest house tonight. The car will come at 9 tomorrow morning." The study door closed with a quiet click that echoed like a gunshot. Grace knelt down in front of the three children, gathering them close as Maya's tears finally came and Michael's silent sobs shook his small body. Marcus remained dry-eyed but held on to his siblings with fierce protectiveness. Have you ever witnessed someone's fear overpower their capacity for love? What do you think it would take to change a heart that's been closed by pain? Share your thoughts below. "Come on, babies," Grace whispered, her own voice thick with tears she couldn't shed. "Not yet. Let's get you something to eat. And don't you worry. This story isn't over. Sometimes the best families take a little time to recognize each other." But as she led them toward the kitchen, Grace caught sight of Richard's shadow still standing motionless behind his study door, and she wondered if some hearts could ever be opened again, or if they remained forever locked by their own grief. Outside, the California sun continued to shine on the rose garden Elena had loved, on the fountain where she'd once spoken of second chances, and on a house that held everything needed for healing, if only its master could find the courage to let love in. The heavy oak door of Richard's study slammed shut with a finality that seemed to shake the entire mansion. Inside, Richard pressed his back against the mahogany panels, his breathing shallow and rapid. His hands trembled as he reached for the crystal decanter on his desk, 18-year-old Macallan that had been a gift from his business partner in Manhattan. It was barely noon, but the amber liquid burned away the image of three small faces crumpled in confusion and hurt. Outside his sanctuary, he could hear Grace's voice, soft and soothing, trying to explain the unexplainable to children who had already endured too much rejection in their young lives. The sound made his chest ache with something he refused to name. "Come on, babies," Grace was saying, her Georgia accent thicker now, the way it always got when her emotions ran high. "Let's get you settled in the guest house. It's got a beautiful view of the garden, and there's hot chocolate in the kitchen." Richard squeezed his eyes shut, but he couldn't block out Maya's small voice asking, "Miss Grace, why doesn't our new daddy want us? Did we do something wrong?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He poured another scotch. Through the tall windows of his study, Richard could see Grace leading the children across the perfectly manicured lawn toward the guest house, a charming cottage that Elena had designed for visiting family. Elena had always imagined it filled with laughter, with grandchildren who would spend summers splashing in the pool and chasing fireflies through the California twilight. But these weren't Elena's grandchildren. These were strangers. Children who carried the weight of a promise he'd never made, a commitment born from his wife's guilt-ridden fever dreams and medication-induced fantasies about redemption. Marcus walked with his chin up, but Richard could see the way the boy's small fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. Maya clutched her rolled-up drawing against her chest like armor. Michael hadn't let go of his teddy bear, and something about the child's quiet acceptance of disappointment made Richard's stomach churn with self-loathing. What kind of man turns away children? The thought came unbidden, in Elena's voice, soft and disapproving. Richard pushed it away and focused instead on the familiar rhythm of justification that had carried him through 6 months of sleepless nights. He hadn't asked for this. The adoption had been Elena's idea, conceived during those terrible final weeks when the morphine made her speak of atonement and second chances. She'd talked endlessly about the children in Atlanta, how they'd been abandoned by their birth parents, bounced between foster homes, how they needed stability and love and a chance to be more than their circumstances. "We have so much, Richard," she'd whispered one night, her hand impossibly light in his. "This house is too big for just us. My heart is too big for just us." But Elena's heart had always been too big. It's what had drawn him to her 25 years ago at a charity gala in San Francisco, when he'd been a young venture capitalist more interested in tax write-offs than genuine compassion. She'd been volunteering with an organization that provided art therapy for traumatized children, and when she'd spoken about her work, her entire face had glowed with purpose. She'd made him want to be better than he was. For a while, he'd succeeded. Now, without her softening influence, Richard felt all his old instincts returning. The careful calculation that had built his fortune. The emotional distance that had protected him through a childhood where affection was earned through achievement and love came with conditions. The unconscious prejudices he'd absorbed from his father, a man who'd built his real estate empire in the 1960s with handshake deals and gentlemen's agreements that kept certain neighborhoods certain colors. Richard had thought he'd outgrown all of that. 25 years with Elena had convinced him he had. But standing in his foyer 30 minutes ago, looking down at 3 beautiful black children who expected him to be their salvation, he'd felt something ugly and familiar rise in his chest. Fear. Resentment. And yes, if he was being honest with himself, prejudice. The whiskey wasn't helping. If anything, it was making his thoughts clearer, more brutally honest. He was a 58-year-old white man who'd lived his entire life in spaces where he was comfortable, surrounded by people who looked like him and shared his assumptions about the world. What did he know about raising black children? What did he know about the conversations he'd need to have with them about navigating a world that might not always welcome them? What did he know about being the kind of father they deserved? Nothing, he thought bitterly. I know nothing. His phone buzzed. A text from his lawyer in Century City. Adoption finalization hearing scheduled for next month. Need to discuss next steps. Call me. Richard stared at the message until the screen went dark. Next steps. As if this was just another business transaction, another deal to be structured and executed with due diligence and careful risk assessment. But children weren't investments. They couldn't be diversified or hedged against loss. They required something Richard wasn't sure he had left to give: unconditional love. The kind of love that Elena had possessed in abundance, the kind that didn't calculate odds or worry about returns. A soft knock on his study door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Mr. Richard. Grace's voice was carefully neutral, but he could hear the steel underneath. The children are settled. We need to talk. Not now, Grace. His voice sounded hoarse even to his own ears. Yes, now. The door handle turned, and Grace stepped into his sanctuary without permission. Something she'd never done in 15 years of employment. Her usually gentle features were set in hard lines, and her dark eyes blazed with an anger he'd never seen before. Those babies are sitting in that guest house asking me why their new family doesn't want them, she said, her voice low and controlled. And I don't have an answer for them. Because I don't understand it myself. Richard turned his back to her, staring out at the garden where Elena's roses bloomed in defiant beauty. "You wouldn't understand. It's complicated." "Complicated." Grace's voice rose. "Mr. Richard, I've watched you grieve. I've seen you at your lowest. But I have never seen you be cruel." The word hit him like a slap. "I'm not being cruel. I'm being practical. Those children need more than I can give them." "What they need," Grace said quietly, "is what every child needs. Love. Stability. Someone who sees them as a blessing instead of a burden." Richard's grip tightened on his glass. "Elena is gone, Grace. Her dreams died with her. Sometimes our deepest fears make us push away the very things that could heal us. What do you think it takes to break through walls we build around our own hearts? Share your thoughts below." "No," Grace said, stepping closer. "Her dreams are sitting in that guest house, hoping their new daddy will give them a chance." Richard finally turned to face her, and Grace saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not anger. Not defiance. Fear. Raw, desperate fear that made her heart ache for the broken man hiding behind expensive suits and carefully constructed walls. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't be what they need. I can't be what Elena thought I could be." Grace studied his face for a long moment. Then, with deliberate care, she walked to his desk and picked up the adoption papers, her fingers tracing the children's names with tender reverence. "Mrs. Elena knew exactly who you were when she set this in motion," she said softly. "Maybe it's time you remembered too." She placed the papers back on his desk and moved toward the door. But before she left, she turned back one last time. "Those children have been disappointed by every adult who was supposed to love them. Don't be another name on that list, Mr. Richard. Be the exception." The study door closed with a soft click, leaving Richard alone with his whiskey, his fears, and the sound of children's laughter drifting in through the windows from the guest house, a sound his home hadn't heard in 25 years. The storm that rolled in from the Pacific that evening seemed to mirror the tempest brewing within the Hawthorne mansion. What had started as gentle California drizzle quickly escalated into a full-blown deluge, with winds that rattled the mansion's tall windows and rain that drummed against the roof like urgent fingers demanding attention. Grace stood in the guesthouse doorway, watching sheets of water cascade from the overwhelmed gutters. The small building, usually charming with its ivy-covered walls and quaint garden entrance, now felt impossibly vulnerable against nature's fury. Inside, she could hear the children's nervous whispers as thunder rolled across Beverly Hills like a freight train. "Miss Grace." Maya's small voice called from behind her. "The lights keep flickering." Grace turned to see all three children huddled together on the small sofa, their eyes wide with concern. Marcus had positioned himself protectively in front of his siblings again, but even his brave facade was cracking. Michael clutched his teddy bear tighter with each lightning flash that illuminated the guesthouse windows. As if summoned by their fears, the electricity chose that moment to fail completely, plunging them into darkness broken only by the sporadic illumination of lightning strikes. "It's okay, babies," Grace said softly, feeling her way to the flashlight she'd placed on the kitchen counter earlier. "These old California storms can be dramatic, but they pass." But even as she spoke, she knew they couldn't stay here. The guest house had been built in the 1940s, and while charming, it wasn't designed for the kind of weather now battering the estate. She could already hear water dripping somewhere in the back bedroom, and the windows were starting to rattle in their frames with each gust of wind. Through the rain-lashed darkness, she could see the warm glow of the main house. Richard would have backup generators, a stone foundation that had weathered decades of California's moods, and rooms large enough that 3 frightened children wouldn't have to feel trapped by the storm's fury. But getting there meant crossing the courtyard in this downpour. More importantly, it meant facing Richard's wrath. "Miss Grace," Marcus said, his voice trying to sound braver than his 7 years allowed. "Maybe we should go to the big house? Maya's scared, and Michael's been coughing since the temperature dropped." Grace looked at the 3 faces illuminated by her flashlight beam. These weren't just any children seeking shelter. These were Richard's children, whether he wanted to acknowledge it or not. Elena's children. And no storm, meteorological or emotional, was going to keep her from protecting them. "You're absolutely right, Marcus," she said, gathering their few belongings. "Let's go home." The dash across the courtyard was treacherous, with Grace holding Maya and Michael's hands while Marcus bravely took point, his sneakers splashing through puddles that hadn't existed an hour earlier. The fountain Elena had loved was overflowing, turning the usually pristine driveway into a series of rushing streams. Grace used her key, the one Elena had insisted she keep for emergencies, to let them into the mansion's side entrance. They stood dripping in the mudroom, 3 small children and 1 determined woman, all of them soaked to the skin but finally safe from the storm's violence. That's when Richard appeared. He stood in the doorway leading to the main house, his silver hair perfectly combed, his cashmere sweater immaculate, holding a brandy snifter that caught the light from the mansion's emergency lighting. For a moment nobody moved. The only sounds were the children's chattering teeth and the continued fury of the storm outside. "The guest house isn't safe in this weather," Grace said before Richard could speak. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held a challenge. "The roof's leaking and the power's out." Richard's jaw tightened. "There are hotels." "In this storm," Grace interrupted, something she'd never done in 15 years of employment. "With 3 children. On roads that are already flooding." As if to emphasize her point, a particularly violent gust of wind sent something crashing in the courtyard. Probably one of the potted olive trees Elena had imported from Tuscany. Marcus stepped forward then, his wet hair plastered to his forehead, his chin raised with the kind of dignity that comes from having learned too young that the world doesn't always welcome you with open arms. "We won't touch anything," he said quietly, looking directly at Richard. "We'll stay in just 1 room. We promise we won't make any mess." The simple courage in those words hit the room like a physical force. Here was a 7-year-old boy, soaked and scared, offering to make himself invisible just to be allowed basic shelter from a storm. Maya moved closer to her brother, her rolled-up drawing now soggy and torn at the edges. "I can sleep on the floor," she whispered. "I don't mind floors." Michael said nothing, but his teddy bear was dripping steadily onto the marble tiles, creating a small puddle that somehow looked like an accusation. Grace watched Richard's face in the dim emergency lighting. She'd worked for this man long enough to recognize the signs of an internal battle, the slight twitch in his left eye, the way his free hand clenched and unclenched at his side. She'd seen the same expression during Elena's final weeks, when he'd struggled between hope and the terrible fear of losing everything again. "The blue room," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the storm. "3rd door on the left. There are towels in the hall closet." He turned to leave, but Grace's voice stopped him. "Mr. Richard." She paused, choosing her words carefully. Mrs. Elena always said this house was meant to be filled with life. Maybe tonight, the storm is just reminding us of that. For just a moment, Richard's carefully constructed mask slipped. In the emergency lighting, Grace could see the man Elena had fallen in love with 40 years ago. Vulnerable, capable of tenderness, frightened of his own capacity for love. Then the mask returned. Just for tonight, he said. Until the storm passes. But as he walked away, Grace noticed he moved toward the kitchen rather than his study, and she heard him opening cabinets, the sound of soup cans being retrieved, the quiet hum of the gas stove being lit. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Beverly Hills. But inside the Hawthorne mansion, for the first time in months, there were children's voices echoing through rooms that had been silent too long. And in the kitchen, a lonely man was heating soup for 4 people instead of 1. The storm had forced them together. Now Grace could only hope that proximity might accomplish what words and legal documents could not: the slow, careful construction of something that might, eventually, become a family. Sometimes it takes an external force, a storm, a crisis, a moment of vulnerability, to bring people together who were meant to be family. Have you ever experienced a situation where circumstances forced you to see someone in a completely new light? Share your thoughts below. Thunder rolled across the mansion's roof, but inside, the sound of children's laughter was beginning to mix with the storm's symphony. And in that blending of sounds, natural fury and innocent joy, lay the first fragile notes of healing. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline morning that made the Beverly Hills mansion sparkle like something from a fairy tale. But inside the house, the real storm was just beginning. Richard sat in his study, staring at a photograph he'd hidden in his desk drawer for 6 months. Elena on their wedding day, radiant in white silk, her dark eyes full of dreams about the family they would build together. Grace knocked softly and entered without waiting for permission, carrying a silver tray with coffee and something else, a worn leather photo album that Richard hadn't seen in years. "We need to talk," she said quietly, setting the tray on his desk and settling into the chair across from him. For the first time in 15 years, she wasn't asking permission to sit in his presence. "Grace, I don't think." "About Elena," she continued, opening the album. "About why she really wanted those children." Richard's hands stilled on his coffee cup. "What are you talking about?" Grace turned the album toward him, revealing photographs he'd forgotten existed. Elena as a young woman, volunteering at an orphanage in Atlanta. Elena held black children, reading to them, braiding their hair. Elena with tears streaming down her face as she said goodbye to kids who would never have permanent homes. "She never told you about her work in Atlanta, did she?" Grace's voice was gentle but firm. "Before she met you, before the money and the mansion, Elena spent 3 years working with children who had been abandoned by the system." Richard stared at the photographs, seeing his wife in a context he'd never known existed. She never mentioned. "Because she knew you wouldn't understand. Not then." Grace turned another page, revealing a photo of Elena with 3 children. Not Marcus, Maya, and Michael, but others who looked just like them. "She told me about a little girl named Patricia who used to draw pictures of the family she dreamed of having, and twin boys who would hold her hands during thunderstorms because they were afraid no one would come if they called for help." Grace's voice grew softer. "Elena never got over leaving them behind. She carried their faces with her every day of your marriage." Richard felt something crack open in his chest. "Why didn't she tell me?" "Because she was afraid you'd see it as charity instead of love." Grace reached into her apron pocket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. "She wrote you a letter before she got sick. She was going to give it to you on your 20th wedding anniversary, but—" Her voice trailed off as she handed him the envelope. Richard's name was written across it in Elena's familiar script, but underneath, in smaller letters, were the words, "For when you're ready to understand." With trembling fingers, Richard opened the letter. Elena's voice seemed to fill the room as he read. My dearest Richard, if you're reading this, it means I've found the courage to tell you about the children in Atlanta. Not Marcus, Maya, and Michael. They came later, when God decided to give us a second chance. I'm talking about the children who taught me that love isn't about biology or skin color or any of the small things that divide us. It's about showing up, day after day, for people who need us. I know your childhood was different from mine. I know your father filled your head with ideas about bloodlines and proper families and keeping people at arm's length. But Richard, I've watched you for 18 years, and I've seen who you really are when you think no one is looking. You're the man who secretly pays the college tuition for Grace's nephews. You're the man who drives through what's every Christmas, leaving envelopes of cash for families who will never know your name. You have so much love inside you, but you've been taught to be afraid of it. Don't let fear win. Don't let my death be the end of our capacity to be a family. The children who are coming to us, Marcus, Maya, and Michael, they aren't charity cases. They aren't obligations. They are gifts. They are the family we always wanted but were too scared to reach for. Love them, Richard. Love them like I wish I could have loved Patricia and the twins and all the others who slipped through my fingers. Love them like the father I know you can be. Forever yours, Elena. P.S. Grace knows everything. I asked her to help you when the time came. Trust her. She understands love in ways that money can't teach. Richard's hands shook as he set down the letter. The study was silent except for the ticking of Elena's antique clock and the sound of children's laughter drifting in from the garden, where Marcus was teaching his siblings how to throw a perfect spiral with the football Grace had bought them. She set up the adoption 6 months before she got sick, Grace said softly. She'd been working with Mrs. Rodriguez for 2 years, going through all the paperwork, the background checks, everything. She wanted to surprise you. Richard looked up at Grace, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. You knew. All this time, you knew what she was planning. Grace nodded. She made me promise to help you understand. She said you'd be scared at first, that you'd try to push them away because that's what you do when you're hurting. But she also said you were the strongest, most loving man she'd ever known, and that love would win in the end. I don't know how to be a father to them, Richard whispered, the admission scraping his throat raw. I don't know how to love children who don't share my blood, my history, your skin color. Grace finished gently. Richard's silence was answer enough. Grace leaned forward, her eyes holding his with compassionate firmness. Mr. Richard, I've worked in this house for 15 years. I've seen you at your best and your worst. And I can tell you this. Those children upstairs don't need you to be perfect. They don't need you to have all the answers. They just need you to try. She stood and moved to the window, watching Marcus help Maya climb the old oak tree while Michael collected fallen leaves below them. Elena used to say that family isn't about who you're born to. It's about who you choose to love, and who chooses to love you back. Have you ever discovered something about someone you love that completely changed how you saw them? Sometimes the people closest to us carry secrets that could transform everything. What do you think Richard will do with this revelation about Elena's true heart? Share your thoughts below. Richard joined her at the window, watching his children. And for the first time he allowed himself to think of them that way. Marcus had Maya's complete trust as he guided her to the next branch. Michael was arranging his leaves in careful patterns, the same way Elena used to arrange her flowers. They weren't strangers anymore. They were Elena's final gift to him, and his final gift to her memory. What do I do now? He asked. Grace smiled, the first real smile she'd given him since the children arrived. Now you go outside and learn their names for real. You ask Maya about her drawings. You listen to Marcus talk about the stars. You help Michael add bottle caps to his collection." She paused, her hand on the doorknob. "And you remember that Elena is watching, hoping you'll choose love over fear." As Grace left him alone with Elena's letter and the sound of children's laughter, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Terrifying, overwhelming, life-changing hope. The past was unchangeable, but the future was still being written. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to pick up the pen. The next morning brought an unexpected California coolness to Beverly Hills, the kind of weather that made even mansion walls feel less imposing. Richard found himself standing in the kitchen doorway at 7 a.m., watching Grace prepare breakfast while soft voices drifted from the dining room. "Maya, you can't put syrup on scrambled eggs," Marcus was saying, his voice carrying the patient exhaustion of an older brother who'd had this conversation before. "Why not?" "You put ketchup on everything," Maya replied, and Richard could hear the smile in her voice. Michael's quiet giggle followed, the first sound Richard had heard from the boy since their arrival 3 days ago. Grace glanced up from the stove, catching Richard's eye. "They've been up since 6, she said softly. Maya wanted to watch the sunrise from the big window in the living room. Said she'd never seen one from somewhere so high up. Something twisted in Richard's chest. He'd watched thousands of sunrises from that very window during his sleepless nights, but he'd never thought of them as something beautiful. Just another day to endure. "Mr. Richard," Grace continued, her voice carefully neutral, "Maya drew something for you yesterday. It's on the counter." Richard's eyes found the paper immediately. A riot of crayon colors showing a big house with too many windows to count and 4 stick figures standing in front of it. One tall figure in a dark suit, one smaller figure in what looked like an apron, and 2 children holding hands with a third slightly apart, all under a bright yellow sun that took up a quarter of the page. "She asked me what your favorite color was," Grace said, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. "I told her blue. That's why the door is blue instead of brown." Richard picked up the drawing, his fingers careful not to smudge the waxy lines. In the bottom corner, in careful first-grade letters, Maya had written, "Our new home." "She keeps asking when you're going to eat breakfast with them," Grace added quietly. The voices from the dining room grew louder as what sounded like a minor syrup-related crisis erupted, followed by Marcus trying to mediate and Maya defending her breakfast choices with the passion of a Supreme Court justice. Before he could talk himself out of it, Richard walked into the dining room. 3 heads turned toward him in perfect synchronization, forks frozen halfway to mouths. The silence stretched for a heartbeat that felt like an hour. "Good morning," Richard said, the words feeling rusty from disuse. "Good morning, sir," Marcus replied immediately, his posture straightening. Maya gave a small wave with sticky fingers, while Michael just stared with those enormous brown eyes that seemed to see everything. Richard gestured toward the empty chair at the head of the table, Elena's old spot that he'd avoided for months. "May I?" Maya nodded so enthusiastically that her curls bounced. "Grace made extra pancakes. She said you might want some, but Marcus said rich people probably don't eat pancakes. But I said everybody likes pancakes because they're basically happiness you can eat with syrup." Despite himself, Richard felt his mouth twitch upward. Happiness you can eat. Aha. That's what Miss Johnson at our old house used to say. She made pancakes every Sunday after church, and they were almost as good as Grace's. But don't tell Grace I said almost because she might think I don't appreciate her cooking, which I totally do because yesterday she made grilled cheese that was like if clouds were made of cheese and sunshine. Marcus shot his sister a look that clearly said, "Breathe." But Richard found himself genuinely curious about this stream of consciousness. "Miss Johnson sounds very wise," he said, settling into the chair. "She was. She taught me that if you're sad, you should paint something happy, and if you're happy, you should paint something that makes other people happy too. That's why I drew you the house picture. Grace said you might be sad because your wife went to heaven, and I thought maybe a happy house picture might help." The words hit Richard like a physical blow, but somehow not in the way he'd expected. Instead of the usual sharp grief, he felt something softer, warmer. "That was very thoughtful of you, Maya. Do you like it? I made the sun extra big because Grace said you work too much inside and probably don't see enough sunshine." Grace appeared at that moment with a plate of pancakes and a knowing smile. "Maya, let Mr. Richard eat his breakfast. But I want to know if he likes the picture." Richard looked down at the drawing again, seeing details he'd missed before. Maya had drawn flowers around the house, Elena's roses, he realized. She'd even included the fountain, though it looked more like a blue blob with squiggly lines shooting up from it. "I think," Richard said carefully, "it's one of the most beautiful pictures I've ever seen." Maya beamed so brightly that Richard felt something crack open in his chest. When was the last time he'd made someone this happy with just a few words? "Really? Even though the windows aren't even and I ran out of brown crayon so some of the house is purple." "Especially because of the purple," Richard said, surprising himself. "It makes it unique." Michael spoke for the first time since Richard had entered the room, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maya makes everything more colorful." "What about you, Michael?" Richard asked gently. "What do you like to do?" Michael's grip tightened on his fork, but he answered, "I collect things. Bottle caps and rocks and sometimes leaves if they're really special." "What makes a leaf special?" "If it's a perfect shape, or if it has good colors, or—" Michael paused, glancing at his siblings for support. "Or if I found it on a really good day." Richard felt Grace's eyes on him from across the room, but for once, her presence felt encouraging rather than judging. "I'd like to see your collection sometime, if you'd be willing to show me." Michael nodded shyly, and Maya clapped her hands together. "This is the best breakfast ever. We're like a real family." The words should have terrified him. Instead, as Richard looked around the table at three children who somehow made his enormous dining room feel exactly the right size, he realized that for the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about being alone. Have you ever experienced a moment when something you were afraid of turned out to be exactly what you needed? Sometimes the things that scare us most are actually the keys to our healing. What do you think? Marcus finished his pancakes and looked directly at Richard. "Sir, thank you for letting us stay here. I know we're probably not what you expected, but we'll try to be good kids." Richard set down his fork, emotion thickening his voice. "Marcus, you don't have to try to be anything other than exactly who you are." And in that moment, sitting in his dining room filled with the chatter of children and the scent of Grace's pancakes, Richard Hawthorne began to remember what home was supposed to feel like. The morning after their evening of connection started like a dream that Richard almost believed could be real. He found himself in the kitchen earlier than usual, drawn by the sound of quiet laughter and the smell of Grace's famous pancakes. Maya was at the counter, carefully measuring flour while Grace guided her hands, and for a moment, just a moment, Richard allowed himself to imagine this was his life. Mr. Richard. Maya's face lit up when she saw him. "Look, Grace is teaching me to make heart-shaped pancakes. Want to help." Something warm and unfamiliar stirred in his chest. I suppose I could try." But as he reached for an apron, his phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. The display showed 17 missed calls from his business partner, Jonathan Whitmore, and the preview of a text that made his blood run cold. Emergency board meeting. Photos leaked. Damage control needed now. Richard's hands trembled as he opened his phone fully. There, splashed across the screen, were paparazzi photos from yesterday's trip to Rodeo Drive. Pictures of him walking with 3 black children, buying them clothes, looking almost happy. The headlines were already brutal. Hawthorne heirs? Millionaire's mysterious new family raises questions, and, from mourning to controversy, the Hawthorne adoption scandal. His chest tightened. His carefully constructed world, the world of board meetings and country clubs, of old money and older prejudices, was closing in. He could already hear the whispered conversations at the Pacific Palisades Country Club, see the raised eyebrows at charity galas, and feel the subtle ostracism that would follow. What's wrong? Grace's voice seemed to come from very far away. Marcus, ever perceptive, looked up from his astronomy book. Are you okay, Mr. Richard? The concern in the boy's voice should have melted his heart. Instead, it triggered something ugly and defensive, all the fear and prejudice he'd been pushing down for days. The child's care felt like judgment, their presence like an invasion of everything he'd worked to build. Don't, Richard's voice came out sharp, colder than he'd intended. Don't call me that. The kitchen fell silent. Maya's small hands stilled on the measuring cup. Michael looked up from his bottle cap collection, confused and suddenly wary. Richard, Grace said quietly, a warning in her tone. But the walls were going back up now, brick by brick. His phone kept buzzing with messages from his attorney, his publicist, his business associates. The real world, his world, was demanding he choose. And standing in this kitchen, surrounded by children who looked nothing like him, who came from nothing like his world, Richard felt the weight of everything he stood to lose. I mean it, he said, his voice growing harder. This isn't working. What isn't working? Marcus asked, but there was something in his voice now, a recognition of abandonment that no 7-year-old should possess. Richard looked at him, this brave little boy who'd been trying so hard to be the man of the family, and instead of seeing courage, he saw complications. Instead of seeing a child who needed love, he saw a reminder of everything that made him different from his peers, everything that made him vulnerable. This whole arrangement, Richard said, gesturing vaguely at the kitchen, at the children, at the life Grace had helped him begin to build. It's not, we're not. We're not what? Grace's voice was dangerously quiet. We're not a family. The words exploded out of him, harsh and final. You're not my children. This isn't some heartwarming story where love conquers all. This is real life, and in real life, people like me don't. He stopped himself, but it was too late. The damage was done. Maya's eyes filled with tears. Michael clutched his teddy bear tighter. But it was Marcus who spoke, his young voice carrying a dignity that made Richard's cruelty even more shameful. People like you don't what, Mr. Richard? Don't love people like us. The question hung in the air like a blade. Grace stepped forward, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. How dare you, she whispered. How dare you stand in this kitchen, Elena's kitchen, and break these children's hearts because you're too much of a coward to admit you care about them? Grace. No. Her voice rose, 15 years of holding her tongue finally breaking free. Elena asked me to help you see. She believed you could be the father these children needed. But you're so terrified of what your fancy friends might think, So afraid of being judged by people who never knew your heart that you'd rather destroy 3 innocent children than risk your precious reputation. Richard's face flushed red. You don't understand the pressures. The pressures? Grace laughed bitterly. Mr. Richard, I've worked in your world for 15 years. I know exactly what you're afraid of. You're afraid of loving someone who doesn't look like you, doesn't come from your world, doesn't fit into your neat little boxes. You're afraid of being human. Maya was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked at the heart-shaped pancake batter she'd been so proud of moments before. Michael had retreated to the corner, making himself as small as possible. Marcus stood frozen, processing this newest rejection with the terrible resignation of a child who'd learned not to hope too hard. That's enough, Richard said, his voice like ice. Pack their things. Call Atlanta. This experiment is over. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of destruction that touched every corner of the kitchen. Grace stared at him as if she'd never seen him before. Elena would be ashamed of you, she said quietly. Richard's face went white. Don't you dare. She would be ashamed, Grace repeated, her voice breaking. She chose these children. She believed in them. She believed in you. And you're throwing it all away because you're too proud and too scared to let yourself be loved by children who see past your money to the man you could be. Have you ever seen someone destroy something beautiful because they were afraid of being vulnerable? Sometimes our greatest fear isn't that we're not worthy of love, it's that we are. What do you think it takes to overcome that kind of fear? Richard turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word, leaving behind 3 heartbroken children and a woman who just watched 15 years of patience and hope crumble in the space of a few terrible minutes. In the silence that followed, Maya's quiet sobs were the only sound. Marcus put his arms around his siblings, his young face set in grim determination. It's okay, he whispered, though his own voice was shaking. We'll be okay. We always are. But Grace, looking at these 3 beautiful children clutching each other in the ruins of what could have been their home, wondered if any of them would ever really be okay again. Outside, the sun was shining on Beverly Hills, but inside the Hawthorne mansion, it felt like the darkest night had fallen. The Beverly Hills mansion had never felt so silent. Richard sat alone in his study at 2:17 a.m., surrounded by the ghosts of his choices. The grandfather clock in the corner, Elena's favorite, inherited from her grandmother in Savannah, ticked away the seconds like a countdown to judgment. On his desk lay 3 drawings Maya had made during their brief time together. One showed a big house with 4 stick figures standing in front of it, all holding hands. Another depicted a man in a suit reading bedtime stories to 3 children. The third was simply the word Daddy written in purple crayon, decorated with hearts and stars. He'd found them crumpled in the guesthouse wastebasket after his cruel words had shattered everything. After he'd looked into Maya's tear-filled eyes and said, "You're not my real children. You never will be." The memory made him physically sick. Grace had taken the children to her sister's house in Compton that evening. She'd returned alone, moving through the mansion like a woman preparing for war. She'd packed their belongings with military precision, each folded shirt and carefully placed an indictment of his failure. "They asked me why their new daddy hated them," she'd said, standing in his study doorway 3 hours ago. Her voice had been steady, but Richard could see the fury burning behind her eyes. Marcus asked if it was because they weren't white. Maya wanted to know if she could paint her skin a different color so you'd love her. Richard had tried to respond, but Grace had held up her hand. "Michael hasn't spoken a word since this afternoon. Not one word. Do you know what that child has been through? Do you know what it takes to make a 7-year-old boy go completely silent? She'd placed Elena's final letter on his desk, the one he'd been too afraid to read. Your wife knew exactly what she was doing when she arranged this adoption. She knew those children needed you, but more than that, she knew you needed them. Elena saw what I've seen for 15 years, a good man drowning in fear and calling it wisdom. Grace had paused at the door, her hand on the frame. I loved Elena like a sister. I've loved you like family, even when you made it hard. But I won't watch you destroy 3 innocent children because you're too scared to risk your heart again. Tomorrow, I'm taking them back to Atlanta. You can live with your precious isolation, and they can find parents who actually want them. Now, hours later, Richard sat with Elena's letter in his trembling hands. He'd read it 17 times, each word cutting deeper than the last. My beloved Richard, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and 3 beautiful children are standing on our doorstep, hoping for a father. I know you're scared. I know you're angry at me for leaving you, for making this choice without consulting you first. But I also know the man I married, the man who held my hand through every chemotherapy session, who learned to braid my hair when I was too weak to do it myself, who never once complained about the medical bills or the sleepless nights. These children lost their parents in a car accident in Atlanta. Marcus, Maya, and Michael. They're siblings and they're survivors. The system wanted to separate them, but I couldn't let that happen. I remembered what you told me about growing up alone in that boarding school after your parents died, how you promised yourself you'd never let a child feel abandoned. You're going to want to send them away. You're going to tell yourself you're not equipped for this, that you're too old, too set in your ways, too broken by losing me. But Richard, you have so much love left to give. I've seen it in how you tend my roses, how you remember every story I've ever told about my childhood, how you still leave coffee for Grace exactly the way she likes it even though she's never asked. Don't let fear rob you of the family we dreamed of having. Don't let grief convince you that your heart is too damaged for love. These children need what you need at their age. Someone to see them, to choose them, to fight for them. Grace will help you. She's stronger than both of us combined, and she understands what family really means. Trust her. Trust yourself. Trust that love is always worth the risk. You saved me from loneliness when we met. Now save these children from the same fate. And maybe, in the process, save yourself. Forever yours, Elena. P.S. Maya loves to paint. Her dream is to have an art room with big windows and lots of natural light. I thought the sunroom facing the garden would be perfect. Richard's tears fell onto the paper, blurring Elena's careful handwriting. He looked around his study, at the leather-bound books he'd collected but rarely read, at the awards and photographs that documented a successful but ultimately hollow life, at the chess set where he'd played countless games against himself because he had no one else. This room had become his prison. This house had become his tomb. But down the hall, 3 bedrooms waited empty. Bedrooms Grace had prepared with such love and hope. A sunroom that could become Maya's art studio. A backyard where Marcus could set up a telescope to study the stars. Quiet corners where Michael could feel safe enough to speak again. Have you ever been at a crossroads where you had to choose between safety and love? Sometimes the biggest risk is not risking anything at all. What would you do in Richard's position? Share your thoughts below. Richard stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours in the leather chair. He walked to the window overlooking the driveway where, just days ago, 3 children had stood with their small suitcases and enormous hope. The fountain Elena had loved still bubbled softly in the moonlight. The roses she'd planted were beginning to bloom again after the winter. Life persists, despite loss. Beauty returning, despite pain. He thought about Marcus, standing so protectively in front of his siblings, shoulders squared against a world that had already hurt him too much. He thought about Maya's drawings, her innocent belief that families could be created with crayon and paper and love. He thought about Michael's silence, a silence Richard recognized because it lived in his own heart. These children didn't need a perfect father. They needed a father who was willing to try, willing to fail, willing to learn. They needed what Elena had given him: unconditional love and the patience to heal together. Richard picked up his phone and dialed Grace's sister's number. It rang once, twice. Grace. Her voice was alert despite the hour. "They're my children," Richard said, his voice breaking on the words. "Bring them home. Please. Bring my children home." The silence on the other end stretched for an eternity. Then he heard Grace's quiet sob, followed by the sound of rustling sheets and whispered voices. "Daddy!" A small voice came on the line. Maya, sleepy but hopeful. "Daddy, is that you?" Richard closed his eyes. Elena's letter pressed against his chest. "Yes, sweetheart. It's me. Come home." 6 weeks had passed since that first terrible day, and the Hawthorne mansion in Beverly Hills had transformed into something Richard never thought possible. A home filled with laughter, chaos, and the beautiful noise of children who finally knew they belonged. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Richard sat at the breakfast table, helping Michael with his math homework while Maya painted watercolor flowers at the other end. Marcus was in the garden with Grace, checking on the vegetable patch they'd planted together. Carrots and tomatoes that would be ready just in time for Thanksgiving. "Dad, look." Maya held up her latest masterpiece, a painting of their family standing in front of the mansion, everyone holding hands. In her 7-year-old imagination, even the house looked happy, with bright yellow windows that seemed to smile. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Richard said, and meant every word. The man who once flinched at the word, "Dad," now wore it like a badge of honor. "Should we hang it in the gallery with the others?" Maya beamed. The formal gallery that once housed priceless art now displayed a growing collection of finger paintings, school projects, and crayon masterpieces. Richard had personally overseen the installation of each one, treating Maya's artwork with the same reverence he'd once reserved for his Picassos. Grace entered through the patio doors, her arms full of fresh herbs from the garden, with Marcus close behind carrying a basket of cherry tomatoes. At 62, she seemed to have discovered a fountain of youth in these children's presence. Her step was lighter, her smile more frequent, and her humming had transformed from wistful melodies to joyful songs. "Mr. Richard," Marcus announced proudly, "Grace says the tomatoes are perfect for the pasta sauce tonight, and I counted 17 perfect ones." 17 exactly? Richard asked with mock seriousness. "Are you absolutely certain it wasn't 16? Or perhaps 18? Marcus giggled, a sound that still amazed Richard with its power to heal wounds he didn't know he carried. "I counted twice. Grace taught me to always double-check important things." "That's excellent advice," Richard said, catching Grace's eye. She nodded approvingly, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. Double-checking important things. Like learning to love again. Like discovering that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about choice. The phone rang, interrupting their morning rhythm. Richard glanced at the caller ID and smiled. "It's Mrs. Rodriguez from Atlanta," he told the children. "She likes to check on how you're settling in." But this time, when he answered, Mrs. Rodriguez had different news. "Mr. Hawthorne, I'm calling with wonderful developments. The children's adoption has been finalized. It's official, They're legally your children now. Richard felt his knees grow weak. Officially. Officially. The judge signed the papers this morning. Marcus, Maya, and Michael Hawthorne are home for good. When Richard hung up, he found 6 expectant eyes staring at him. Even Grace had stopped her bustling to listen. "Well?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral in the way children learn when they've been disappointed too many times before. Richard knelt down so he was at their eye level. Something Grace had taught him in those early stumbling days of learning to be a father. "You're stuck with me forever now," he said softly. "Officially, legally, permanently stuck with me. How do you feel about that?" The explosion of joy nearly knocked him over. Maya launched herself into his arms while Michael wrapped himself around Richard's leg. Marcus, ever the protector, hung back for just a moment before joining the group hug with tears streaming down his face. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's life completely transformed? When fear finally gave way to love? Share your thoughts about second chances and the families we choose. Over their heads, Richard met Grace's eyes. She was crying too. Tears of joy and relief and profound satisfaction. She had kept her promise to Elena. She had helped him remember how to love. "Grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "would you call the caterer? I think this calls for a celebration dinner." "Already on it," she said with a knowing smile. "I took the liberty of ordering a cake this morning. Chocolate with vanilla frosting, the children's favorite." "How did you know?" Richard asked. "Because I know you," she said simply. "I knew this day would come. Elena knew it too." That evening, as the sun set over the Santa Monica Mountains, the Hawthorne family gathered around the dining room table that Grace had been setting for 4 all along. The good china caught the light from the crystal chandelier, but the real sparkle came from the faces around the table. Marcus was explaining his science project about the solar system, complete with hand gestures for planetary orbits. Maya had convinced everyone to wear the flower crowns she'd made from garden daisies. Michael, no longer the quiet, withdrawn boy who'd arrived 6 weeks ago, was teaching Richard the proper way to make a paper airplane. "Daddy," Maya said suddenly, the word falling as naturally as breathing, "are you happy we came to live with you?" Richard set down his fork and looked around the table, at these 3 incredible children who'd turned his mausoleum into a home, at Grace who'd had the courage to fight for love when he'd forgotten how, at the warm light spilling across faces that had become more precious to him than any treasure in his possession. "Maya," he said, his voice steady and sure, "you 3 are the best thing that ever happened to me. This house was just a building before you came. Now it's home." Later, after baths and bedtime stories and promises about weekend trips to Disneyland and Anaheim, Richard found himself in the garden where Elena's roses bloomed more beautifully than ever. Grace joined him there as he somehow knew she would. She would be so proud, Grace said quietly, not needing to specify who she meant. "I was so afraid," Richard admitted. "Afraid I'd fail them. Afraid I'd fail her memory." "Love isn't about being perfect," Grace said. "It's about showing up, even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared." They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of a house full of life. Somewhere upstairs, Marcus was probably reading by flashlight under his covers. Maya was likely arranging her stuffed animals for the perfect sleep configuration. Michael was definitely holding that worn teddy bear close, but now he held it with the security of a child who knew he was wanted. "What does home mean to you? Is it a place, or is it the people who love you unconditionally? I'd love to hear your thoughts about what makes a family complete." 6 months ago, Richard Hawthorne had been a lonely millionaire with a house full of empty rooms and a heart full of walls. Tonight, he was a father tucking in 3 children who called him daddy and meant it. Tomorrow, he would wake up to the sound of laughter echoing through halls that had forgotten what joy sounded like. As he turned to go inside, Richard paused at Elena's rose garden one last time. "Thank you," he whispered to the night air, to her memory, to the love that had guided 3 children across the country to find their way home. And somewhere in the gentle evening breeze that stirred the roses, he could swear he heard her voice whispering back, "You remembered how to love me more. You remembered." The Hawthorne mansion settled into peaceful silence, no longer a monument to loneliness but a sanctuary where love had finally conquered fear, where 3 children had found their father, and where a man had discovered that the greatest fortune wasn't the one you inherit, it was the family you choose to create. In Beverly Hills, under the California stars, the Hawthorne family slept soundly, complete at last. Thanks for sticking with this story till the very end. But trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. The next story is crazier, more shocking, and will blow your mind. Click the image on your screen now and dive right in. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single twist.